Welcome to Season 1 of Press the Button. As part of this 10-episode season called Taking Back the Narrative, we are handing the microphone to members of communities affected by nuclear weapons, so they can share their stories and their experiences in the ways they want them to be told. Today's guests are Haleema Saadia and Mari Faines. Haleema is a lecturer at the National University of Modern Languages and a research fellow at the Rhodes Initiative, and Mari Faines is partner for mobilization at Global Zero. They are also co-chairs for the Basic EVM Policy Cohort. Their research is focused on challenging racism and white supremacy in nuclear weapons policymaking. In this episode, they will discuss how racism impacts society at all levels and the ways this intersects with our security priorities. And then next week, we'll be talking to Jasmine Owens about how impacted communities are often left out of the conversation about nuclear weapons and how their experiences are often ignored or minimized.
Racism plagues all levels of society, but we don't often talk about how it intersects with our security priorities. These priorities have been historically set by the white, Western, male elite, and more often than not at the expense of people of color. Nuclear weapons policy is no exception to this history. Indian author Arundhati Roy once said, "Nuclear weapons are at the heart of whiteness." There is evidence that racism is embedded in nuclear weapons history and doctrine. These weapons have disproportionately harmed Indigenous people and communities of color, and in spite of the fact that Indigenous people and people of color have played a key role in nuclear resistance movements for decades, established nuclear weapons teaching ignores their perspectives. So today, we're going to create space for this conversation. I'm joined by Haleema Saadia and Mari Faines. Haleema is a lecturer at the National University of Modern Languages and a research fellow at the Rhodes Initiative, and Mari is partner for mobilization at Global Zero. They are also co-chairs for the Basic EVM Policy Cohort focused on challenging racism and white supremacy in nuclear weapons policymaking. Thank you both so much for joining this conversation.
Thanks for having us.
Can you start by explaining to our listeners in what ways racism affects nuclear weapons policymaking, and what are some of the human consequences of previous policy decisions?
Yeah, I think racism is something that has been affecting nuclear policymaking since its inception, right? In 1945, when these weapons were created, we had a moment that it was only given to particular powers. And before we get too nuanced into racism, what I really want to talk about, Alex, is the root of white supremacy and talking about this as a system of white supremacy rather than an individual call out of a particular subset of people. I think that's really critical when Haleema and I are doing our work, because so often when people hear the juxtaposition of racism and white supremacy, they get really stuck in saying that we are only talking about individuals. But what we're talking about is a system that privileges white Western voices, particularly in security, by giving them access to what they would consider better security measures. But this system can be upheld by a multitude of different groups, as long as you believe in the framework. And so when you reach back to where does racism fall into effect, you outlined it. It is who has been disproportionately impacted by things like uranium mining, who's been generationally negatively impacted by health impacts of nuclear testing. And then at an academic level and a policymaking level, whose voice has been consistently excluded from the conversation when we're talking about the lived experiences of those who have been impacted, and how do we get to a place of disarmament and hopefully a place of abolition?
Yeah, and nuclear weapons, they're not just symbols of power and prestige. They depict a history of racism and white supremacy in their development, possession, and use. And like Murray just pointed it out, despite that, the nuclear weapons have not been used, against states, or they haven't been exchanged between states. It's the marginalized communities globally which have suffered the profound impact of nuclear weapons used. And it's, the colonized and indigenous communities in Algeria, Marshall Islands, French Polynesia, Australia, who continue to suffer through the consequences of nuclear war, despite the fact that nuclear war hasn't happened. But yet they suffered through the radioactive fallout of nuclear testing in their territories. And they are the ones who are experiencing early mortality, disease, displacement, contamination of food sources and ecosystems. And it's all because of the racist nuclear weapons policy making. Racism, it's also an important theme that runs through the Western non-proliferation discourse. Western states categorize nuclear proliferation as a civilizational, political, cultural, and sociological phenomena, rather than taking it as a technological challenge. A nuclear non-proliferation discourse has largely been shaped by the West, and the colonial thought patterns are quite visible in this discourse. So the arguments that were used to justify the possession of nuclear weapons by a few haves, these arguments discredit the acquisition and possession of nuclear weapons by the haves not. And in context of the nuclear aspiring countries in the third world, this imperial binarism created an other, which was technologically backward and had inferior management practices or deficient safety standards, and just could not master the complex nuclear technology. So this whole backdrop, racism in context of nuclear weapons means that nuclear weapons are the ultimate colonizers. Their legitimacy is limited to a few states, and people of a given ethnicity or skin color are just not considered worthy to be protected against nuclear weapons or nuclear radiation.
And I think to that point, Haleema, when you're thinking about in the modern day, it is a neo-colonial practice in itself to still engage in a nuclear weapons complex. We would be naive if we didn't acknowledge the ways in which colonial powers use proxy states for conflict over their nuclear weapons. If we're going to reflect on things like the current crisis in Ukraine, right? We had an entire moment where we talked about how there were so many non-Western countries that were in absentia due to their relationship with nuclear powers such as Russia or China, and the ways in which their engagement in the development of things like the New Age scramble for Africa have manifested in a way that allows for nuclear weapons to be centered at the forefront of who has access to security and who doesn't. And the ways in which we've chosen to colonize and engage with non-Western countries has meant that they have had to look for new avenues to engage with these security structures. And these weapons are not the answer. And so the more that we uphold this ideology, I think also that non-Western voices are not sane enough, which is often what we hear in the racialized language talking about who should be allowed to hold these weapons, is also a problem, and shows the ways that racism are so deeply embedded in the psyche of our policymaking, and we are unable to engage with particular populations because we genuinely don't know how to speak to them or don't know what a security world order looks like when there is equity and justice written into the byline.
Thank you both so much. You hit on so many things there. And before we talk about solutions to this immense system that needs to shift, you're both mentioning the harm that the system has also already created. So the word justice comes to mind. How do we center justice in policymaking on this issue, taking into consideration the legacy of nuclear weapons and the work that needs to be done going forward?
Yeah, so in concept, nuclear justice entails holding individuals, countries, and systems accountable for the harmful effects of the nuclear weapons complex on people, and especially the marginalized people, and also the environment. Now, centering justice in policymaking must begin with accountability. And it means that it must involve criminal liability, reparations, truth-telling, and also institutional reforms, which should be aimed at preventing the repetition of this nuclear harm that these communities have already suffered. Centering justice should also lead to legal, political, moral, and economic accountability of the countries involved in nuclear injustices. And as such, I think it covers a whole range of concerns. For example, the right to compensation for the victims of nuclear weapons, the right to health and environmental protection, the right to live in a world free from the threat of nuclear war, or the right to participate in decision making about nuclear weapons. And once you see all this debate, one common strand in this call for nuclear justice is creation of just and equitable world, which is not possible until the world is free of nuclear weapons. Now, If you are familiar with how the UN disarmament machinery talks about non-proficient disarmament initiatives, there is one terminology that is often used, and it goes something like equal and undiminished security for all. And the point is that states and people cannot have equal and undiminished security unless justice is at the center of the policy making.
Yeah, I think all of those points are spot on. And I think one of the things that I also want to acknowledge is there is no justice without acknowledging that this is not a monolithic narrative for what agency, redress, or remediation looks like. The ways in which the nuclear weapons complex has impacted marginalized communities is not a homogenous narrative across the globe. If I am talking to those that were impacted in the Southwest of the United States, it's a very different conversation than what I'm having with those who were impacted on the Marshall Islands or in the Marshallese diaspora, or even who I would be talking to those impacted by uranium mining across the African continent. The first place to start when we're discussing this level of justice is providing an opportunity for agency for those who have been impacted. That means inclusion at the table. We have to acknowledge that the lived experiences of those who have been impacted by nuclear weapons are an essential framework for understanding a pathway forward. Then we can have a conversation about what does policy making look like? Because we're not in a predicament where we can say, we know what is best for somebody who has been generationally impacted by a system that has disenfranchised them once, twice, three, multiple times over. We're no longer just looking at a place where we are solely looking at one issue of justice. We're not just looking at an economic issue. We're not just looking at a climate impact. We're not just looking at even a racial justice impact. We're looking at where all of those things intersect, and that has to be addressed in the policy making that is being done. And it's not just at a multilateral, multinational level. That's local, that's federal, and then it is globally. And so if we're going to have real conversations about what justice looks like, the first place we have to start, and this is something that Haleema and I have talked about in depth with our group, is bringing those folks who have these real experiences back into the conversation and really figuring out what do they need. Then we can talk about what looks equitable. What does the world of possibilities look like beyond this bomb? And what does a new security world order look like that is inclusive of those who have often been forgotten in these ever so important conversations?
So you mentioned how key it is to have diversity at the table. What is your hope about how increased diversity can impact the debate on nuclear nonproliferation? And also, what are concrete steps that people can take to bring these people into the conversation meaningfully and not just giving them a physical chair?
Yeah, so increased diversity in international forums related to nuclear weapons would lead to a more informed, inclusive, and creative debate. Diversity of perspectives and insights can lead to new ideas and solutions to non-proliferation challenges, and it can also help overcome stereotypes, which are reflective of the racial dynamics that we are talking about here. And just to be clear, the debate on nuclear non-proliferation happens at different levels, from intergovernmental to non-governmental, and from lawmaking in international institutions to advocacy groups. And diversity in itself goes beyond the gender-limited debate, and it also includes ethnicity, color, geographic representation, and race. Now, increased diversity can also break the deadlock by offering creative solutions because it brings in fresh perspectives and alternative worldviews. The innovative and effective solutions can transcend the critique often labeled against the traditional nuclear order regarding discrimination and prejudice. But then there is one problem, or perhaps one challenge, that bringing in diverse views, it kind of brings along. And that's the issue of consensus building on how to move forward on non-proliferation issue. Now, consensus building is considered a challenge. And by bringing in diverse views, perhaps it would become even more difficult. But having said that, candid discussions, the sincerity to move forward, and listening and understanding and addressing the security concerns, these can lead to a favorable outcome. Now, diversity is also required within states, and that would lead to perhaps valuing alternative positions, especially the voices of marginalized people, which can lead to a comprehensive security policy, which values human security as much as traditional security. And regarding nuclear policymaking, inclusion of diverse and even dissenting voices can strengthen the social contract between the people and the state. And it can also build the trust between the dominant and the marginalized communities within a state.
100%. And I think what is so interesting to me, Alex, about your question is how do we increase diversity is we weren't always in a homogenous space when we were talking about nuclear weapons. I think people look at the past decade or so and get really trapped in the lack of diversity in conversations. But the original movement for the abolition of nuclear weapons was a diverse movement. It included people from the civil rights. It included people from the feminist movement. It included people from the US, from Europe, from Africa, from South America. It was a global conversation because you had global and civic world leaders like Martin Luther King saying things, talking about how it would be absurd to work to integrate schools and lunch counters and then not have a world where there was survival for them which to integrate. There was this larger and robust conversation that really did get us from the point of decreasing weapons in the post-Cold War. And then that dissipated. And that dissipated for a plethora of reasons. You know, you talk about the fact that people went back to the individual movements in which they were engaging because they needed to have more work done there. But then there was also the erasure of the work that they had done to get us to this point. And so when we talk about bringing diversity back into this conversation, it really should be about getting us back to a place where we're making the forward progress that we had begun to see so many decades ago. And as Haleema pointed out, that again that looks multilateral for stakeholders. That is the inclusion of those who didn't previously have a voice in those conversations. That is the inclusion of people who did previously have a voice and stepped away to do other things. When you include diverse voices in the conversations, you get more robust answers and solution to these incredibly complex problems. If we are going to be transparent in our national security and our foreign policy across the globe, it means you have to include those members of the globe. We are not a homogenous space. I think the final thing I'll say is when we talk about global majority peoples are marginalized communities. They are Black and brown people across the globe. Like that is the majority makeup of the globe. We have to acknowledge that by excluding them from the conversation, we are taking away an entire chunk of people that is continuing to grow and continuing to gain power. And as we work for what does this world look like in the next 10, 15, 20, 100 years, it's going to look incredibly different. And it's going to be incredibly alienating and problematic if we don't take the time now to address the things and the issues of the past to get us to a place where we can have an equitable and just solution of the future.
Thank you both. I think that it is incredibly tragic to think about the progress that we have in fact lost when it comes to this issue, and also the future that we risk seeing if we don't do something about it right now. So I really appreciate your frank assessment of that, because I think we need this reality check and we need it now, and we can't be ignoring the issues that this has been plaguing our movement. So this is a big ask. This is a really monumental adjustment that needs to take place if we're going to see progress. So how do you think we can change the policies, the rules, the institutional issues you outlined that guide the international nuclear order so that change can occur, so that agency is given to Indigenous and non-white individuals that want to work in this system and that are affected by this system?
Once we think of international nuclear order and perhaps what kind of a systemic change needs to occur, we first need to understand what kind of system is already in place. So nuclear deterrence is one key basis of the post-World War II international order. But the problem with deterrence is the paradox of deterrence, which means that threat of nuclear war has to be made in order to prevent war. So if you think it in this way, as long as peace is at the mercy of nuclear annihilation, we can't have a just and equitable international order. And in context of nuclear weapons and international order, the systemic change that needs to come about is to give the global South a seat at the table. I mean, why is it that the 5 permanent members of UN Security Council are also the only NPT recognized nuclear weapon states? Why cannot a non-nuclear weapon state become a permanent member of the Security Council as well? The systemic change also requires negotiation of new arms control and disarmament treaties. For example, look at the UN disarmament machinery, which is stuck in the Cold War dynamics and has largely been in a stalemate for decades. Also, the system of domination and control with the neo-colonial practices, it is built on the ashes of colonization, but it needs to be reformed as well. And the last thing that I want to add here is that elimination of nuclear weapons may address the threat of nuclear annihilation, but the threat of war would still remain. So conflict resolution and perhaps conflict transformation would be key for establishing a peaceful and just international order.
Yeah, I really want to double down on that exact point that you made at the end there, Haleema, around decolonizing the nuclear space and decolonizing the nuclear system is not just about the nuclear world order. It is not operating in a vacuum. It is not operating in a silo. The nuclear world order and the way that it manifests itself on the security and global security writ large impacts other pieces of conflict. It impacts other pieces of economic stability, immigration and migration, climate destruction. You run the list, all of these large issues that we see that we are needing to tackle on a global scale. Nuclear weapons fit in the crux of those issues. If we are going to change this system, we have to acknowledge that there has to be a global change in the way that we see these powerful nations wield their power against others. It is incredibly inequitable. And at the crux of that is simply acknowledging the ways in which colonization specifically is continuing to manifest itself on non-Western nations. And that is the reality of the situation. And I think that that's hard for people to think about from a policy perspective, because the further you get away from what seemed like the dominance of these countries, the more that you see non-Western nations engage at a multilateral, multinational level. It is easy to say that there is no chance of conflict, or there is no domination, or there is no miscalculation of power between the two. But that's naive, because at the crux of this, you still don't allow an opportunity for, in particularly non-Western and marginalized communities, to have a seat at the table in the most important conversation. Nuclear weapons affect everyone. This idea that if you hold them, you are deterring what could happen affects everyone, which means everyone should be allowed to work within the system to change it, to make it more equitable and more just. So I guess for me, the first place that we really have to start when we are talking about changing this system is decolonizing the ways in which we engage with it. And once we begin to have that conversation at a level that is diplomatic and in the right channels, then we also need to talk about the ways in which we need to decolonize our thinking in a civil society, NGO, and academic level. Because only when we engage in that type of conversation about the lack of voices, the lack of engagement, the lack of experience that is missing from these conversations, that is the only way that this system holistically is going to see the shift that we need into a new space where we can talk about equitable and just security frameworks.
I know that this work can be absolutely overwhelming, and I just want to say thank you both for your commitment to this and pushing these changes that we need to see and educating people about how we make these shifts, but also why it is so important that we do, not only for the nuclear weapons system, but for our entire security infrastructure. So with that, how can our listeners want to learn more and also educate themselves and be change makers in this space?
I think the first thing I would say to listeners is resilience is a virtue, and it's an essential piece of this work. Alex, you just referenced like how difficult it is to particularly think about some of these issues, these really tough ones. But for marginalized communities, Black people, Brown people, Indigenous folk, we don't get the opportunity to turn off thinking about the ways in which colonization and white supremacy and racism manifest themselves on us in our daily lives. It is required that we engage on these issues to continue to advocate for ourselves and reclaim the agency that we deserve in these conversations. And so I think there's a two-pronged approach for if you want to continue to engage on this particular issue. I think for those of us who are of marginalized communities, it is continue to advocate for yourself. Continue to validate your experience, continue to do the work that is necessary that show that we deserve to be in the room, we deserve to be at the table, and we have something to say to create this new world that we're looking for. For people who do not fall into that category, who choose to be accomplices in this work, it is truly that, being an accomplice. It is learning about this issue. There are incredible Indigenous organizations working on this thing. You know, you had Benedict Kabua-Madison on a couple weeks ago. Marshallese Educational Institute is a wonderful place to learn about what has happened to them. You know, at Global Zero, we're doing a lot of work on intersectionality specifically, really talking about how do you take nuclear weapons from the silo and having real and frank conversations, both at a petition and a policy level, about how do you do that. Basics EVN program. All of the folks that are working on those different working groups are thinking about these issues in a plethora of ways. And if I've learned one thing from my working group, is it does not matter what country you come from, these weapons affect you. And we are all kind of having the same conversation. You would think that when you talked about racism, I think a lot of people assumed it's an American issue, but it wasn't. We are from Pakistan, we are from England, we are from Nigeria, Australia, you name it. And we were seeing the same ways in which these systems of colonization and white supremacy were manifesting themselves on our communities. Find groups that are doing that good work and educate yourself on what they are talking about, what are the resources they are sharing, and how can they get involved. Because this undercurrent and this movement of particularly marginalized voices, young people, others that are thinking about how do we push ourselves to the place that we need to be, it exists. And it will not be silent forever. And so by platforming the opportunities like this for us to talk about these issues, I think is the first step in really getting to a place where then we can amplify for policymakers, for governments, et cetera, what needs to change.
Yeah, all excellent points, Marie. And I just want to add, a few things to it. Perhaps the nuclear policy forums, they need to seek out non-white experts and activists as speakers and contributors. The mainstream media, it needs to give a platform to these voices. Then there is also a need that the academic publishers give space to people from Global South in journals and in books. Then, the very important thing that we have, consistently talked about in this session is giving non-white people a place on the decision-making bodies on nuclear non-proliferation. Then with regards to supporting non-white organizations working on nuclear issues. For example, there are so many organizations in the Global South which can be a valuable resource for information and advocacy. And by supporting these organizations, reaching out to them, understanding their point of view, amplifying their voices, perhaps we can build a more inclusive movement for nuclear non-proliferation. For example, the Rhodes Initiative, where I'm a research fellow, it's a Pakistan-based think tank. And it is doing some amazing work in security studies and nuclear issues from a post-colonial perspective. So yeah, do check it out.
I think the last thing, Haleema, you brought to my brain is these people exist in the field. They exist in government, they exist in civil society, and they can speak on your panels, write in your journals, be on your TV interviews, talking about things other than being the diversity in the room. They have real understanding of these issues and nuanced views that are essential to get us to where we need to go. Do not be afraid of the fact that they are challenging the status quo of what the nuclear world order looks like. Only then are we going to get to a space where we have the equity and justice that we're looking for. So I really do push people to get comfortable being uncomfortable, because this work is hard, but it is going to take all of us.
I so appreciate both your time and all your remarks. And I have to say, as overwhelming and daunting as the challenges we work on can be, you leave me incredibly optimistic. And I am incredibly excited to be a part of and continue to see these changes, because I think what keeps all of us going at the end of the day is also hope. And you both have so much of that, and I'm going to carry that with me as I continue all of the work as well. So really appreciate both your time, and thank you again for joining Press the Button.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thanks for listening to Press the Button. This podcast is produced and edited in Washington, D.C. by Alex Hall, Angela Kellett, and Loan Billett, and in San Francisco by Charles Crosby. Audio engineering by Jacqueline Shing. Our theme song is Black Nymph by Peridot. To continue the dialogue and support our work, visit plowshares.org.